My name is Arturo, and on the day I turned 75, my own son and his wife made me understand that I was worth less than the dust on the old furniture in the house I built for them. They didn't have to scream it. They didn't even have to look me in the eye. They just left me standing in the middle of the living room with a store-bought cake and a silence so heavy it felt like a tombstone. That was the day I realized that for them, I was already dead. They were just waiting for me to be buried. It's a cold, hard thing to learn that the life you dedicated to someone means nothing more than an obligation, a tiresome story they no longer want to hear, a bitter lesson, one that strips you bare right down to the bone. What would you do in my place? When the person you sacrificed everything for, the one you carried on your shoulders so they could reach higher, looks at you as if you were a nuisance, a stone in their shoe. Listen to my story until the end, and tell me, what would you have done? I also need to know from which city in Mexico you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this feeling, that someone out there understands this weight. If you want to hear more stories like this one, where life eventually settles the score, subscribe to the channel. Your company, even from afar, means more to me than you can imagine right now. I need to feel that my voice is reaching someone. That day had started with a glimmer of hope, a foolish one I see now. I had woken up early, the house smelling of cinnamon and coffee, just like when my Elena was still with me. I had even prepared a small pot of asterisk mole, using her old recipe, hoping they'd stay for lunch. My son Javier and his wife Karina were supposed to come at noon to celebrate. They arrived at 3, with hurried faces and the kind of forced smiles you give to a stranger on the street. They placed a small box on the table and sat on the edge of the sofa, as if they were afraid the old fabric would stain their fancy clothes. Javier was glued to his phone, scrolling and scrolling, while Karina looked around the room with a sour expression, her eyes judging every crack in the wall, every faded photograph. I tried to break the ice, to fill the uncomfortable silence. I started telling them about the time I laid the first stone for this very house, how I mixed the cement with my own hands until they bled, dreaming of the family that would grow within these walls. I was pointing to the main beam in the ceiling, the one I carved myself, when Karina let out a loud, impatient sigh. She turned to Javier, but she spoke loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "Can we go? He just repeats the same old stories. It's like talking to a broken record. We have real lives to get back to, important things to do." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel, like pieces of broken glass. I looked at Javier, waiting, praying he would say something, defend me, anything. But he just nodded, put his phone in his pocket, and stood up, not even daring to meet my gaze. They were gone in less than a minute. A quick, cold, "Happy birthday, Papa!" A pat on the shoulder from Javier that felt more like a push, and the sound of the front door closing behind them. The silence they left behind was deafening. I stood there, in the middle of the room, looking at the cheap, impersonal gift they'd left on the table, a tie, when they know I haven't worn one in 20 years. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a hot, living thing. What I felt was a cold, creeping emptiness, the kind that hollows you out from the inside. It was the chilling certainty that I was no longer a father, a grandfather, or even a memory worth keeping. I was just an old man, a burden, a broken record repeating stories no one wanted to hear anymore. In their world of important things, I had become completely and utterly irrelevant. I wasn't born into a world of comfort, you know. My life started in a small adobe house in a dusty village in Zacatecas, where the sun beats down without mercy and the only thing you truly own is your word and the strength in your arms. My father was a man of the fields, a asterisk jornalero, and he taught me that dignity isn't found in what you have, but in what you build. He'd come home with his hands cracked and his back bent, but his eyes were clear. He'd say, "Arturo, a man who works with his hands is a man who speaks the truth." That lesson stuck with me more than any schooling ever could. It became the foundation of my entire life, the first stone I ever laid, long before I learned to mix cement or saw a straight line in wood. It was the only inheritance he could give me, and I guarded it like gold. It was in that same village that I met my Elena. She wasn't the prettiest girl, not in the way the songs describe, but she had a light in her eyes that saw right through the dust on my clothes and the calluses on my hands. She saw the man I wanted to be. We married young, with nothing but a shared dream of a life built on solid ground, a life better than the one our parents had. We moved to the city, to a growing neighborhood on the outskirts of Guadalajara, where there was work for a man willing to sweat. We rented a tiny room, but in her presence it felt like a palace. She'd say, "Our home isn't these 4 walls, Arturo, it's the space between us." And I believed her. Every peso I earned was a brick in the foundation of that future we imagined together. Our son Javier was born in that little room. I remember holding him for the first time, so small and fragile, his tiny hand wrapped around my finger. In that moment, a promise formed in my heart, silent but stronger than any oath sworn in a church. I promised him that my hands would work until they bled, if it meant his would one day hold a pen, a degree, a future I could only dream of. I wanted him to reach higher than I ever could, to stand on my shoulders and see a horizon I never knew existed. Elena and I, we looked at him and we saw our legacy, not of money or land, but of opportunity. He was the house we were truly building, the most important project of our lives. The years that followed were a blur of hard work. I started as a simple laborer, an albañil, carrying buckets of sand and mixing concrete under the scorching sun. But I watched, I learned, and I worked harder than anyone else. Soon, they made me a maestro de obra, a foreman. I was proud of that title. It meant I wasn't just strong, I was smart. I could read blueprints, manage men, and turn a pile of bricks and rebar into a place where a family could be safe. I'd come home, smelling of sawdust and sweat, my body aching in places I didn't know I had. But then I'd see Elena smile and hear Javier's laughter, and the exhaustion would just melt away. That was my fuel. That was my reward. I remember one year, for his 6th birthday, Javier wanted a bicycle more than anything in the world, a shiny red bicycle he'd seen in a store window downtown. We didn't have the money, not with the rent and the food and saving for his schooling, but I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his eyes. So for a month, after my long days at the construction site, I took on a side job, repairing furniture for a neighbor. I'd work late into the night in our small patio, by the light of a single bulb, sanding and varnishing wood until my fingers were raw. The morning of his birthday, when he saw that red bicycle waiting for him, his face lit up like the sun. That joy, that pure, unadulterated joy, was worth every splinter, every sleepless hour. From the day he started school, Elena and I were united in one mission. Javier would go to university. It was a non-negotiable dream. We had a little metal box where we put any spare change. Every week, Elena would diligently put aside money from the housekeeping budget. We never went on vacations. We never bought fancy clothes. Every celebration, every holiday was modest. Our indulgence wasn't in things for ourselves, but in the growing fund for his education. It was our shared secret, our sacred pact. We knew that this sacrifice was the only way to break the cycle of poverty that had chained our families for generations. It was our act of rebellion, our quiet revolution fought with saved pesos and worn-out shoes. The day the acceptance letter came from the university in Monterrey, we cried. All 3 of us. It was a moment of pure triumph. But it was followed by the cold reality of the cost. The tuition, the books, the living expenses. It was a mountain we couldn't climb with our little metal box alone. I had a small plot of land back in Zacatecas, inherited from my father. It wasn't much, just a dry piece of earth, but it was my only tie to my home, to my past. Selling it felt like cutting off a limb, but I did it without a second thought. I never told Javier the full story. I just told him we'd saved up. I didn't want him to feel the weight of that sacrifice. I wanted him to fly free, unburdened. While he was away, the house felt so empty. We'd wait for his calls on Sunday evenings, gathered around the phone like it was a sacred altar. Hearing his voice, hearing him talk about his classes in engineering, about his new friends, it filled our hearts with a pride so immense it was almost painful. I'd walk around my construction sites, looking at the complex plans, and I'd smile to myself, thinking, my son understands this. My son is building the future. I carried his university ID photo in my wallet, right next to the one of Elena. I'd pull it out and show it to the other workers, my voice swelling with pride. That's my boy, I'd say. He's going to be an engineer. Then, the world tilted. Elena got sick. It started subtly, a tiredness that never went away, a pain she tried to hide. But it grew, relentless and cruel. The doctors used big words we didn't understand, and prescribed medicines that cost more than I made in a month. I took on every job I could find, working weekends, working nights. My body screamed in protest, but I ignored it. My only focus was her. I sold my tools, the very instruments of my trade that I had collected over a lifetime. I would have sold my soul if it meant buying her one more day, one more smile. But it wasn't enough. The illness was a thief that couldn't be bribed. The last days were in our room, in the bed that faced the window. I sat by her side, holding her hand, a hand that was once so strong and was now so frail. She made me look her in the eye. "Arturo," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. Promise me you'll always look after Javier. Make sure he never forgets what matters. A good heart, Arturo. That's the only thing we can take with us. Make sure he keeps his." I squeezed her hand, my tears falling onto our joined fingers. "I promise, my love," I choked out. "I promise." It was the last conversation we ever had. A promise sealed in the shadow of death, the most sacred vow of my life. After she was gone, the silence in the house was a physical weight. It pressed down on me, suffocating me. The rocking chair I had made for her sat empty in the corner, a constant, silent testament to my loss. Javier graduated and came home, an engineer, just as we'd dreamed. But the boy who left was not the man who returned. The grief we shared should have brought us closer, but instead, it felt like a chasm had opened between us. He was restless, eager to start his life, a life that seemed to have no room for the quiet sorrow of his old man. I tried to talk to him about his mother, to share memories, but he would change the subject, his eyes distant. Then he met Karina. At first I was relieved. I thought, good, he has someone. He won't be alone. She was polished, educated, from a family with money. She was everything we weren't. And she made sure I knew it. It started with small things. A condescending smile when I served my homemade mole, calling it peasant food. A subtle correction of Javier's grammar when he used a phrase from his childhood. She looked at our home, the home I built with my own hands, as if it were a ruin. She saw the cracks in the walls, not the love that held them together, and Javier, my son, just stood by and let it happen. The distance grew from a crack to a canyon. The weekly visits became monthly. Then they dwindled to just holidays. And even then, they were brief, filled with a tense, awkward silence. Javier would look at his expensive watch, while Karina would scroll through her phone, sighing with impatience. They lived in a different world now, a world of fancy restaurants, country clubs, and important people. In that world, an old carpenter with calloused hands and simple stories was an embarrassment, a relic of a past they were desperate to escape. I was the living proof that they hadn't come from money and they couldn't stand it. I remember one Christmas, 2 years ago. I had cooked for days, preparing a feast, all of their favorite dishes from when Javier was a boy. I waited all day. The sun went down. The food grew cold. Around 9 at night, my phone rang. It was Javier. "Sorry, Papa," he said. His voice rushed. "Something came up with Karina's family. We can't make it. We'll drop by sometime next week." The next day, my neighbor, Doña Vida, mentioned seeing pictures on social media. Javier and Karina had hosted a huge, lavish Christmas party at their modern house across town. They hadn't been with her family. They had just chosen not to be with me. The lie hurt more than the absence. So when I stood there on my 75th birthday, alone in the living room with that cheap cake, her words about my broken record stories echoed with the weight of all those years of sacrifice. It wasn't just an insult. It was the final nail in the coffin of the life I had dedicated to them. It was the sound of my promise to Elena shattering on the floor. Every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, the sale of my father's land, the memory of my wife's last wish, all of it had been erased. In their eyes, my life story wasn't a foundation to be proud of. It was just a boring, repetitive noise they wanted to turn off. I looked at the rocking chair in the corner, my Elena's chair, and in the crushing silence, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was clarity, a cold, hard clarity. They had shown me my value in their world. And now, I understood. The boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw love as a burden and sacrifice as a story not worth hearing. The promise I made to Elena wasn't just about looking after him financially. It was about making sure he kept his good heart, and I had failed. Or maybe he had failed himself. But one thing was certain. The story wasn't over. They just thought they had written the ending. That birthday wasn't a sudden storm. It was the hurricane that finally makes landfall after weeks of seeing it gather strength out at sea. The betrayal had been building for years, brick by brick, just like I had built that house. It started subtly, right after Javier married Karina. The first sign was the food. My Elena had taught me to cook, and our Sunday meals were a tradition. But soon, Karina would call. "Arturo, we can't make it for lunch. We have a brunch reservation with some important people." At first I understood. They had a new life, but brunch became their excuse for everything. It was a word that meant, we have something better to do. The pot of pozole I'd simmer for hours would sit on the stove, a silent testament to an empty chair at my table. The phone calls were the next thing to go. When Javier was at university, our Sunday calls were the highlight of my week. We talked for an hour. After he started working, they became shorter. After he married Karina, they became tasks. I could hear the distraction in his voice, the tapping of a keyboard, Karina whispering in the background. "Is everything okay, Papa?" "Good. Okay, I have to go. Big meeting tomorrow." He was no longer calling to connect. He was calling to check a box. The warmth was replaced by efficiency. I started to dread the phone ringing because the 5-minute hollow conversations hurt more than the silence. It felt like I was calling a busy office, not my own son. Then came my first grandson, Mateo. Holding him for the first time, I felt that old promise to Elena stir in my heart. Here was a new generation, a new chance. But I was kept at a distance. When I'd reach for the baby, Karina would intercept. "Be careful, Arturo. Your hands are so rough from your work." Or, "Let him sleep, he's on a very strict schedule." I was the grandfather, but I was treated like a well-meaning, slightly dangerous stranger. I wasn't allowed to be part of the small, intimate moments that forge a bond. They would send me photos, perfectly posed pictures of their perfect family, and I felt like I was looking at a magazine, not my own blood. The house, my house, became a place they visited, not a home they returned to. They'd walk in, and Karina's eyes would scan everything with a look of faint disapproval. The furniture I had made, the photographs on the wall, the faint smell of sawdust from my workshop in the back, it was all part of a world she was actively pulling Javier away from. She'd make little comments, sharp as a needle. "Oh, you still have this old thing," she'd say, pointing to the rocking chair I made for Elena. To her, it was clutter. To me, it was a piece of my soul. Javier, my son, would just stand there, silent, a stranger in the house he grew up in. The grandchildren were taught to see me as a relic. When they were very young, Mateo and his little sister Sofia would run to me, full of life. But as they got older, I saw the change. They'd come over and be restless, bored. "Abuelo, do you have Wi-Fi? Why is your TV so small?" These weren't malicious questions, but they were echoes of their parents' world, a world of constant stimulation and newness. Karina would tell them, "Don't run around, you'll break something. This house is very old." She wasn't protecting the house. She was building a wall around me, painting me as fragile and out of touch, someone to be handled with care from a safe distance. The visits became shorter and less frequent, until they stopped altogether. My birthdays became markers of the growing distance. For my 70th, they didn't come. Instead, a courier delivered a giant basket of expensive fruits and cheeses, things I never eat. There was a card, signed in a perfect, impersonal script, that I knew was Karina's. Javier hadn't even signed his own name. It was a gesture designed to look like affection while requiring none. It was a transaction. They had paid their dues for the year. I gave the whole basket to Doña Elvira next door. She was more of a family to me than they were. The silence that day was a heavy blanket, and the fancy basket on my table felt like a mockery of everything I thought a family was supposed to be. I watched my son change, as if he were a piece of soft wood being slowly warped by the damp. The boy who used to beg me to let him help in the workshop, who loved the smell of fresh-cut pine, now wore suits that cost more than I made in a month. He started to use Karina's phrases, talking about social capital and personal branding. Once he told me, "Papa, you should really think about getting rid of that old truck. It doesn't project the right image." The truck he was talking about was the one I'd used for 20 years to haul materials to build the very life that gave him his image. He was ashamed of where he came from. He was ashamed of me. Christmas was the hardest. Our home, Elena's and mine, had always been the heart of Christmas. The smell of asterisk tamales and asterisk ponche would fill every room. After Elena passed, I tried to keep the tradition alive for Javier. The first year after he married, they went to Karina's family. "It's their turn, Papa. It's only fair," he said. I understood. But then the next year, it was a ski trip with their friends. The year after, a destination Christmas in Cancun. My home was no longer the destination. It was the place they left behind. I started spending Christmas Eve with Doña Elvira and her family. They'd insist I come over, and I was grateful, but every laugh in her loud, happy home was a painful reminder of the silence in mine. I remember a moment of pure, undiluted humiliation. It was at the baptism of one of Karina's nieces. It was a lavish affair at a fancy country club. I felt out of place in my simple, clean suit. Karina was introducing Javier to a group of her friends, all of them dripping with jewelry and judgment. She gestured vaguely in my direction. "And that's Javier's father, Arturo," she said, her voice dropping as if she were sharing a slightly embarrassing secret. Before I could even say hello, she had turned her back, guiding the conversation to a more interesting topic. I stood there, holding a glass of juice, completely invisible. I was not a person to be known, just a fact to be acknowledged and quickly dismissed. They began to treat my life's work as a real estate opportunity. Javier started bringing it up casually at first. "You know, Papa, this neighborhood is really changing. Property values are going up. You're sitting on a gold mine." He and Karina had plans. They wanted to sell the house, my home, the place where every wall held a memory of Elena, of his childhood. They suggested I move into a small apartment or one of those senior living facilities. They dressed it up as concern for my well-being, saying it would be easier for me. But I knew what it was. They wanted to liquidate their inheritance before I was even gone. They were trying to erase my life story and replace it with a check. The stories, my stories, became the ultimate symbol of their rejection. In the beginning, when I'd tell them about a tough construction job or a funny memory of their grandmother, Javier would at least pretend to listen. Karina would offer a tight, polite smile, but that politeness eroded over time. The smile became a blank stare. The stare became a quiet sigh. The sigh became an eye roll. They didn't see my stories as a legacy, as the oral history of our family. They saw them as the ramblings of an old man, a repetitive, boring soundtrack to their busy lives. They didn't understand that when you take a man's stories away, you take away his past. You tell him that his life didn't matter. I tried to talk to Javier about it once, man to man. I caught him alone for a moment during one of his rare, brief visits. I asked him, "Misho, is everything okay?" "We don't talk anymore." He couldn't even look me in the eye. He got defensive, his voice sharp. "Everything's fine, Papa. You're being overly emotional. Life is busy. We have responsibilities you wouldn't understand." That one sentence, "you wouldn't understand," struck me like a physical blow. I had sacrificed everything so that he could have that life of responsibilities, and now he was using it as a wall to keep me out. He had built his success on the foundation I laid and then declared the foundation obsolete. The emptiness of Elena's rocking chair became a constant ache in my chest. For years after she was gone, I kept it in its place by the window. It was a sacred space. But for Karina, it was just furniture. During one visit, she tossed her expensive leather handbag onto the seat without a second thought. Another time, she draped her coat over it. It was a small thing, a thoughtless gesture, but it felt like a profound violation. She was erasing Elena's presence, my memory of her, with her casual disregard. Javier saw it. He saw it, and he said nothing. In his silence, he was complicit. He was letting his mother's memory be covered up by the trivial clutter of his new life. I realized they saw my sacrifices not as a gift of love, but as a burden of obligation. My calloused hands, my simple clothes, my old truck, these weren't symbols of a father's love to them. They were embarrassing reminders of a humble beginning. They were desperate to whitewash. They wanted the fruits of my labor, but they were ashamed of the labor itself. They wanted the inheritance of the house, but they couldn't stand the man who built it. I wasn't their father anymore. I was a living, breathing liability to their carefully constructed image of self-made success. My past was a stain they were constantly trying to scrub out. The final illusion shattered the day I overheard Karina talking to Javier on their way out the door, thinking I was out of earshot. "We have to do something about him," she said, her voice a low, irritated hiss. "He can't live alone in this big house forever. It's not safe, and it's a waste." A waste. My home, my life, my independence, it was all just a waste in her eyes. And Javier's reply was not a defense of his father. It was a tired, defeated sigh. I know, Kari. I'll look into some places next week. He wasn't just agreeing with her. He was her accomplice. They were already planning my disposal. That was when I understood the full depth of it. I had become a problem to be managed, a loose end to be tied up. The love I had poured into my son had been diluted and washed away by ambition and greed. He was no longer the boy whose face lit up at the sight of a red bicycle. He was a man who looked at his father and saw only a depreciating asset. He looked at the home where he took his first steps and saw only its market value. The promise I made to Elena on her deathbed, to make sure he kept a good heart, echoed in my mind like a funeral bell. I had failed. The slow erosion was complete. My role in their lives had been worn down to nothing, like a stone in a river. First, I was the patriarch, the sinner. Then I was a respected elder. Then, a weekend obligation. Then, a brief holiday phone call. And finally, I was just a problem, a piece of old furniture that no longer fit the decor of their new lives. Each small rejection, each missed call, each condescending glance had been a shovelful of dirt, burying me long before my time. They were just waiting for me to stop breathing so they could finally be free of me. And so, on my 75th birthday, when Karina's cruel words about my broken record stories hit me, it wasn't a new wound. It was the final, brutal twist of a knife that had been lodged in my back for years. It was the moment the slow, creeping poison finally reached my heart. I stood there in the silence of my living room, and I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. They had shown me exactly who they were. They had shown me my worth in their world. And in that moment of absolute abandonment, a new feeling began to take root in the barren soil of my heart. Not a desire for revenge, but a quiet, unshakable resolve. After they left and the silence of the house settled back in, I didn't cry. The time for tears was long past. I walked over to my Elena's rocking chair and sat down, my hands resting on the worn wood, the same way she used to. They thought they had broken me. They thought their words, their coldness, had been the final blow that would leave me waiting for the end, in this quiet, dusty house. What they never knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine in their world of appearances and quick judgments, is that a man who works with his hands learns to be patient. He learns to see the real structure of things, not just the paint on the surface. And I had a secret, a foundation they had never seen, one I had kept hidden for years, waiting for the right time, a time that, it turned out, had finally come. They saw me as a simple man, an old carpenter, good with his hands but not with his head. They thought my world was as small as this house, as limited as my old stories. Javier, with his engineering degree, and Karina, with her sophisticated family, looked at me and saw a relic. A man who knew how to mix cement but couldn't possibly understand their complex world of investments and social climbing. They underestimated me. That was their biggest mistake. They thought my only asset was this house, this piece of land they were so eager to get their hands on. They never once thought to ask about the most valuable project of my life, the one I worked on after all my other jobs were done. It wasn't made of wood or stone. It was built on trust. For nearly 15 years I had a special client. His name was Don Ricardo Vega. He was one of those old money men from Guadalajara, the kind you read about but never see. He had a grand old house in the Colonia Americana, a place that was more like a museum than a home. He was a recluse, a widower with no children, and he was obsessed with true craftsmanship. He found me through a recommendation and hired me to restore the intricate woodwork in his library. It was supposed to be a 3-month job. I ended up working for him, on and off, for the last decade of his life. We weren't friends in the way you have a beer with someone. We were two old men who understood that a thing done right has a soul. He didn't just want repairs. He wanted art. I restored hand-carved doors from the 19th century, rebuilt a staircase that spiraled like a seashell, and crafted furniture that had to match the original style of the house. He would sit for hours in the room where I worked, not saying a word, just watching me. He didn't watch me like a boss. He watched me like a student. He'd ask about the type of wood, the grain, the reason I chose a certain tool. He respected the work. He respected me. In a world that was getting faster and cheaper, we both valued things that were made to last. He saw the man my own son had stopped seeing. Don Ricardo passed away 5 years ago, A month later, I received a letter from a firm of very serious-looking lawyers in a tall, glass building downtown. I thought it was a mistake. I went, wearing my best clean shirt, feeling completely out of place. The lawyer, a man younger than Javier, sat me down and explained that Don Ricardo had named me in his will. He had no family to leave his fortune to, and he had decided to leave a significant portion of it to the man who, in his words, understood that true value is not what something costs, but the integrity with which it is built. I just sat there, my calloused hands trembling on the polished mahogany table, unable to speak. The lawyer explained the details. Don Ricardo had left me 2 commercial properties he owned in the city center, small storefronts that were rented out to stable businesses. He also left me a portfolio of investments managed by his bank. The total value, after all the taxes and legal matters were settled, came to just over 20 million pesos. It was a number so large I couldn't even picture it in my head. I had spent my life counting every single peso, saving for a bicycle, for tuition, for medicine. And now, this. A fortune that could change everything. The lawyer asked me what I wanted to do, and in that moment my first thought was of Elena and the promise I made to her. I made a decision right there, in that fancy office. I told the lawyer that I wanted everything to remain exactly as it was, managed by them under the radar. I wanted to keep living my life just as I had been. I didn't want the money for myself. I was an old man. What did I need with millions? A new truck? A bigger house? No. My life was already built. But Javier's wasn't. I saw this inheritance not as a gift, but as a test. A test for my son. I wanted him to build his own life, to find his own worth through his own work, just as I had. I was afraid that if he knew about this money, it would poison him. It would rob him of the chance to become a man of character. This became my secret pact with Elena's memory. On her deathbed, she'd made me promise to make sure Javier kept a good heart. I believed that easy money would be the surest way to make him lose it. So I waited. I watched him. I hoped that he would prove me wrong, that he would show me the values we had tried to teach him were still there, buried underneath the fancy suits and Karina's influence. I hope one day, when he proves he is a man of substance, a man his mother would be proud of, I will tell him. I will share it with him. The money was never the prize. His character was. The inheritance was just a tool I was holding in trust for his soul. So I continued my quiet life. I still fixed my own leaky faucets, patched the roof, and tended my small garden. I lived on my modest pension from my years as a foreman. The rent from the 2 storefronts was deposited into a bank account that I never touched. It just sat there, growing, a silent river of money flowing beneath the dry ground of my simple existence. My neighbors saw me as old Arturo, the retired carpenter. My son saw me as a burden. No one saw the man who could have bought and sold them all 10 times over. And that was exactly how I wanted it. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a watchtower. I was watching and waiting. Every time Javier and Karina would visit, with their talk of money, of deals, of the importance of image, it was like a small confirmation that my decision had been the right one. They were hungry. They had a hunger that I recognized, but it wasn't for a good life. It was for an easy one. They didn't want to build anything. They wanted to acquire it. They looked at my house not with nostalgia, but with calculation. They saw its value in pesos, not in memories. They were already spending their inheritance in their heads. An inheritance, they thought, consisted only of this plot of land and these 4 walls. There were times it was hard. When my old truck finally gave out, the one I'd had for 20 years, the mechanic said it would cost a small fortune to fix. I could have walked into a dealership and paid cash for a new one without even blinking. Instead, I sold it for scrap and started taking the bus. Javier was mortified. "Papa, what will people think?" he'd said. I told him I was saving money. He saw it as proof of my decline, of my poverty. I saw it as a commitment to my principles. He couldn't understand that a man's worth isn't in the car he drives, but in the path he chooses to walk. The birthday incident was not just an insult, it was a verdict. It was the final, undeniable proof that my son had failed the test. He hadn't just lost his way, he had willingly sold his compass for a map to a treasure that didn't exist. The boy I had sacrificed everything for, the boy whose heart I promised Elena I would protect, was gone. In his place was a man who saw his own father as a broken record, a nuisance standing in the way of his ambitions. He didn't want my stories. He didn't want my love. He just wanted what I had. And in that moment, sitting in Elena's chair, I felt a profound shift inside me. The secret I had kept to protect him now had a new purpose. It was no longer a test for his character. It was a tool for my dignity. The money was no longer a potential inheritance for him. It was a legacy for me. It was a means by which I could finally make sure that Elena's memory was honored in a way that truly mattered. Not by enriching a son who had forgotten her values, but by building something that would last, something that she would have been proud of. They thought they had all the power. They, with their youth, their money, their busy, important lives. They thought I was a powerless old man, a story that was over, waiting for the final page to be turned. But the truth is, the storyteller always has the power. He just decides when to reveal the ending. And I realized my story wasn't a sad song of abandonment. It was a quiet, patient lesson in foundations. They had built their lives on sand, on image and expectation. They had forgotten that the strongest structures are built on a foundation that no one sees. My resolve hardened, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold, clear strength of steel. I was no longer a victim of their neglect. I was the architect of what was to come. They had made me irrelevant in their lives, so I would use that irrelevance as my shield. My invisibility would be my greatest strength. They were about to find out that this old, broken record had one more song to play, and it was a song they would never, ever forget. My hands may be old and wrinkled, but they still knew how to build. And they still knew how to tear things down. The plan began to form in my mind, clear and precise, like a blueprint. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a messy, emotional thing. This was about justice. The kind of justice that doesn't scream, but builds. The kind of justice that honors a lifetime of work and a wife's memory. I would use their greed, their own defining characteristic, as the very tool for their undoing. They wanted my inheritance? Fine. I would give them an inheritance. But it would be one of truth, not money. The time for waiting was over. The time for building had begun. The next morning I woke up with a clarity that felt like a cold dawn. The grief was still there, but it had a new shape. It wasn't a weight anymore. It was a tool. I went to the small desk where Elena used to pay our bills and took out a pen and paper. My hands, which had built walls and roofs, now wrote a different kind of blueprint. I didn't need revenge. Revenge is for people who still have something to prove. I just needed peace. I needed to protect the one thing they couldn't take unless I gave it to them, my dignity. I called the lawyer, the one who managed Don Ricardo's affairs, and for the first time I gave him instructions not as a passive recipient of a gift, but as a man with a final project to build. My voice didn't shake. I was a maestro de obra again, and I knew exactly what needed to be done. The first step was the hardest. I called a real estate agent. A young, sharp woman came to the house and walked through the rooms, talking about market value and curb appeal. She looked at the beam I carved with my own hands and saw a rustic feature. She looked at the garden, where Elena planted her roses, and saw potential for a patio. She was putting a price tag on my entire life, on my memories. But I felt no pain. I realized the house had stopped being my home the moment my son saw it as his inheritance. It was just a property now, a pile of bricks and mortar they were waiting to claim. I signed the papers to sell it, my signature firm. My invisibility to them, their neglect, had become my greatest advantage. They wouldn't know a thing until it was already done. While the for sale sign sat in my yard, a silent announcement to strangers but invisible to my own son, I worked with the lawyers on the real construction. We established the Foundation Elena, a charitable trust. The name felt right, solid, like good wood. The foundation's purpose was simple: to give scholarships to young men and women from poor neighborhoods who wanted to learn a trade. Carpenters, plumbers, electricians, masons, kids who, like me, wanted to build something real with their hands. I took the entirety of Don Ricardo's fortune, that silent river of money, and poured it into this foundation. Then I legally amended my will, directing that the entire proceeds from the sale of my house be added to it. My final testament was clear. My only heir would be the future of others. The house sold in less than a month. The call from Javier came 2 weeks later. He sounded casual, almost cheerful. "Hey, Papa? I was talking to Karina, and we have a great idea for your house. We found a contractor who can—" I let him talk, let him lay out his whole plan to tear down my life's work. When he was done, I waited a beat. "That will be difficult, Mijul," I said, my voice calm and even. "The house is no longer mine. I sold it." The silence on the other end of the line was more profound than any I had ever felt in that living room. It was a silence of pure shock, of disbelief turning into cold, furious realization. "You, what?" he stammered. "You can't do that," I simply replied. "It's done. I have my own plans now." And then I hung up. There was nothing more to say. I now live in a small, clean apartment overlooking a park. I can hear children playing in the afternoon. The rocking chair I made for Elena is here with me, by the window. Last week, I met the first recipient of a scholarship from her foundation, a young woman from a rough barrio who wants to be a master carpenter. She showed me the new tools we had bought for her, her eyes shining with a light I hadn't seen in years, a light of hope, of a future she could build herself. In that moment, I understood. I hadn't lost a son. I had found a new purpose. My legacy wasn't in a bloodline that had forgotten its roots. It was in the foundation of another person's dream. I am no longer a broken record. I am the quiet architect of my own peace, and my Elena's memory is finally safe, not in a house of wood and stone, but in the hands of the next generation. That is a home no one can ever sell.